Welcome, everybody. Tonight, we're going to be working on Unit 8, which covers the topic of functions in MySQL. That corresponds with Chapter 9 in our textbook. As is usual, I will be kind of using a combination of the book resources and some online resources to talk about these topics. And then later on tonight, we will work through the exercises that we have in store for you. All right, so I'm going to go to the topic list here to begin, and I'm going to go right to the W3Schools site. And I know that we've looked at some of this stuff before. In fact, I think I've provided this link in particular before, but I do want to talk about the fact that technically MySQL functions are numerous, for one thing. So these are basically code that's built into the database management system that allows you to do certain actions automatically without having to worry about how that code was created. You just call the command and then sometimes pass it a parameter, right, which is the stuff that goes inside the parentheses, and then that will dictate how that function works. There are lots of functions in MySQL. And what I do like about this other site, the MySQLTutorial site, is they actually put those functions into categories. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But we're going to start here by looking at kind of a list of what I call common MySQL functions. And what you will notice here in the sidebar on W3Schools is they categorize them. And the other site does this as well. So they have functions that focus simply on handling strings, right? And I'm scrolling through them real quickly here on purpose. And then we have functions that focus on doing math, right? So you see a lot of like mathematical terminology here. Then we have ones that focus on working with date and date times. You see, that's a pretty extensive list as well. And then we have what we call advanced functions, which do other kind of things that don't fall into any of the categories that we just looked at, right? So these are ones that are a little weirder, right? And some of them have to do more with system level things than with necessarily the data. Now, we have played with some of these things a little bit if you look at this list. For example, like the cast statement is one of them. All right, let's kind of just quickly rifle through this list. I'm not going to sit here and talk about each function. We'll be here all night if we do that. But when we get to the author's PowerPoint, I thought they did a nice job of showing you, like, when you use a function, what the output of it looks like. So we'll take a look at that list, and we won't worry about that kind of nitty gritty here. What you will notice on these lists, though, is that each one of these things is a link in and of itself and can take you to more information. So for example, if I use, let's say, L case, right, and you can see it converts string to a lowercase. I can click through, go to that. They show an example of the function, and they have a little try it editor where you can play with it and see what we're talking about. And I'll click through on this one just so you can get kind of the general point. But the statement is select lowercase SQL tutorial is fun as lowercase text, right? And they apparently have that in the database somewhere. And then when you click the run SQL button, you'll notice that it takes basically the text that's inside the parentheses and changes it all to lowercase. All capital letters are stripped. So this is we'll call this a rudimentary example. But for all of the functions that we see on this list here, right, there are informational pages that follow each link. So this is a great site in that capacity, because if you're trying to reference, hey, is there a SQL function that does this? For example, this is a great place to come and look it up, right? So this is kind of the main point here. So we do have all of these which relate directly to strings. We will kind of use a few select ones here today during class. So it's going to give you an example of some of the ones we're going to use from this list for our exercises. We will use the concatenate command, which basically joins strings together. We will use the format command, which allows us to put stuff into a pattern that makes it easier to look at the information, usually with numbers, by the way. And okay, and that's kind of weird to say because we're in the string section, but when we're outputting stuff to the screen, it comes back as text. So we want it to look as nice as we can, even if it's a number. We'll also, I'm looking at all the different other commands that might be on this list here. I think we're going to play with L case and U case a little bit. I think we're also going to look at substring. Um, and I think that's most of what we're looking at from this list. When it comes to the numeric functions, and they have a whole breakdown here, and you can see a lot of these relate to terminology that you may have learned in a math class. So if you're doing like geometry or trigonometry or whatever, right? They have functions built in that allow you to run some of those mathematical functions. I'm going to make a little like note here on some of this stuff. And frankly, I've always been a little bit uncomfortable allowing my database to do calculations. Things aside from, I'm going to say, like totaling and averaging and that kind of thing, where usually if I'm doing some of these advanced, let's say like arc cosine or something, I'd probably be more apt to like code something in Python or Java or C sharp, for example, and then take that value and store it in the database rather than have the database do the calculation. But I think it's interesting just to note that MySQL is capable of doing the calculation if raw data is fed into it. Of course, you have to like coerce some of this stuff to get the kind of results you want. So that's kind of a little bit of a learning curve on doing some of those things. In terms of things that we'll use from this list tonight, we'll certainly use the rounding command. I'm trying to think of what else we're going to use on this list. Probably average, I think, might be used tonight, and maybe min and max, if I remember correct. I'm looking at my solutions here to try to remember which things I use. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Just a few select ones. And then the other ones that are on the list here will be really determined by the usage, once again, in your database and the need for it. We'll play a little bit with some of the date time stuff. We are going to do a little bit of date format. We're also going to look at a date difference. And then we're also going to play a little bit with date add. And I'm trying to see if there's anything else here that we're tinkering with. That's about where we're going to leave it with the date time stuff tonight. In terms of some of these advanced functions, I'm not sure that we're using anything really particularly advanced in our code. We are going to do some regular expression stuff, which isn't really listed here on the W3 site, which I thought was interesting. So for the regular expression material, I'm going to refer you guys to this particular page on MySQLTutorial. I'll just drop this in the chat for you really quick, just in case you guys want to go there and, of course, read up on it in depth as I'm talking to you. You might. I'm not sure. But I do want to talk about this as a topic because this becomes a topic that is pervasive in any programming language that you're studying. Usually you don't get introduced to it on an intro level. The reason it's important for databases is this. A regular expression is a unified language that allows you to, using a specific terminology, to determine the type of information and the format of that information before it gets entered into a database. Now, think about this. We learned about data types last week, right? And with data types, when you set up a data type in a table or a database structure, and you're looking for an integer, for example, you don't want people entering words, right? Or if you ask somebody to enter, let's say, for example, the year of their birth, you don't want them typing it out with words saying 1900, whatever, if you feel what I'm saying, right? So we want to ensure that the information going into the database is in the correct format. And that can really kind of extend to a lot of different things. So think about it like this. If I was asking a user to type in, let's say, their weekly salary, and let's say they're fortunate enough to make 4 figures a week, so it's $1,250 a week, and a lot of people might type that as 1, 250, right? and they would try to enter that into a database, and the database would say, you know, we can't take strings. And they're like, but I typed a number, right? Look, it's 1,250, but the comma counts as text, so it's not a number and can't be converted, right? And so what the regular expressions allow us to do is to set a format for when information is allowed to go into a specific field, and then ensure the data is correct before it goes into the database. If you guys are learning other languages, so, and I know a lot of you are in my Python class, and I say that every week, I don't think we really touch upon this too much in the Python class until we get to the advanced class. But when you look at even in the HTML class, we talk about this when we get to the forms and we're inputting stuff into an application. And so the point of this is regular expressions work in a database, and they can also work in a programming language. And most programmers will either prefer to kind of pre-scan the data going into a database via the application that's sending it, as opposed to making the database do it, or we'll have the database do it, but also have the application do it. So in other words, if you're running a website that's capturing the information that's going into your database, you might write HTML code that also has a regular expression in it that ensures, for example, if a person's typing in an email address, it's actually an email address, right? And if you think about the format of an email address, it has a pretty standardized approach, right? So they have a little bit of reading here. I'll let you guys go ahead and do that. But if you want to do this inside of MySQL, there are some statements that we can use that allow us to run regular expressions and basically ensure that data coming in words is converted to the right format. You can also take stuff that's already in the database and adjust it so that it goes into that format and put it in a different spot, or output it on the screen a different way. So for example, if I wanted to work with the regular expression, often we're using it across strings of characters, by the way. So notice like they have a little example here where they have just a little snippet of text that says MySQL, right? And if we're looking to match stuff up to MySQL, so in other words, if somebody comes into the database and searches for that keyword, how do we know that they're inputting the right stuff? You know, is really kind of what we're getting to here. So we have basically the ability to focus in and define, are we sending in digits? Are we sending alphabetic characters? Are they A to Z? Or are they capital A to Z, right? And then we have these little character class switches that you put after the statements, or with the statements is a better way to say it, that make sure that, for example, if I want the number 0 to 9, I need to match like the certain digit. So in other words, match a single digit from 0 to 9 in a certain spot. Or if we're looking to match a word, or if we're looking to match a white space, or like a space in a string, or a tab, or a new line character, carriage return. All of that can be filtered with a regular expression. They have a bunch of little things that they kind of use. So for example, they have these caret symbols, technically is what we call that. We would call those anchors. And then this is kind of like the marker for an end of a string. And so you have this like weird little nomenclature that you use. But just to kind of get to the point of this, if I'm looking to match up a regular expression in SQL, I can take those regular expressions, express them in the standard syntax of a regular expression, and run basically the regular expression function inside of the database to get all of this to work. So I have a little exercise we're going to do on this, and this is kind of a little bit cryptic to explain, but anybody who's worked with regular expressions in a different language and know what I'm talking about, at least to some degree. There's a formatting command that we use, and typically it involves A to Z capitals, A to Z lowercase, or 0 to 9. Those are usually the things we want our users to type in, right? Either numbers or words and letters and strings in certain formats. This is just a reference, so I'm just pointing out the reference here. If you want to read up on regular expressions as a proper thing, you can just go ahead and Google that. And there is a bunch of stuff that talks about how to do this. The Microsoft one is kind of a nice one to look at. And then there's also some websites that are dedicated to nothing but regular expressions. And there's whole textbooks like 3 inches thick written on just this topic. But the fact that it is cross language is a good way to say it, right? So, like the same regular expressions that I use in SQL, I use in Java, C Sharp, Python, JavaScript, HTML, PHP. I can keep going, right? So every like major language supports it. It is an independent library of functions that we usually pull in that I believe does originate from the original C libraries, like a lot of things do. All right, so that's my little spiel on the regular expressions. All right, now I'm going to switch over and talk about the author's slides here. We're going to take a look at some of the functions that they're pointing out. This is a really super long slideshow once again, which I'm not going all the way through. I just do not want to do that to you guys. But I'm going to look at some of the key slides, and they're mostly at the beginning. And then we're going to switch over pretty quickly to working on the homework and take our sweet time doing that for most of the evening, by the way. All right. So when you start to look at the author's PowerPoint here, they start talking about understanding what a function is. And I think, this is kind of interesting from the standpoint of, for those of you in the Python class tonight, we were talking about the same topic in Python. It's just a coincidence that functions are the topic in both classes. So there's some correlations between doing it in Python and doing it in SQL. So the first correlation is when we're in Python, there's a lot of functions that are already built in. For example, when you first learn that code in Python, what's the first thing you do? You use the print command, right? And you think of it like that, as the print command. But the reality is the fact that it says a keyword followed by a set of parentheses, and then usually something goes inside those parentheses, that indicates to you that that is indeed a function, right? And that's kind of like what functions look like, both in a programming language and in the SQL code as well. So usually it's a keyword followed by a set of parentheses. And what that keyword represents is some more complicated piece of code somewhere else in the library that performs a series of actions. So like in Python, if I use the print command, I know that takes whatever text I put in between the parentheses and puts it on the screen. I have no idea how it does it, right? There's some magic code in the background that does it, but I do know that if I put stuff inside the parentheses, inside of double quotes, and run the command, it ends up on the screen, right? And so it's kind of like this invisible device in the background, right? And this is kind of how functions operate. The difference with SQL and Python, though, is in SQL, we're usually, and I say that really cautiously, usually not writing functions, right? If we write code that is custom inside of SQL, we're usually doing we call them stored procedures, technically in MySQL. When we're running a function in SQL or MySQL, once again, it's a pre-built command. We don't know what the secret sauce is. We just know that if I, for example, use the round command, it somehow rounds my number. We don't know the algorithm that's used to do it in the background. So there's a correlation, right? So languages have built-in functions. MySQL has built-in functions, and that's really our focus tonight, is to use the built-in functions. The difference in Python, for those of you in the later class tonight, is in Python, we can write our own functions, right? That's the difference in Python. And it's kind of expected of a programmer that you really build what we call modularity to your programs, where you name a block of code and then it becomes reusable, right, as an entity in and of itself, like the print command, right? All right, so that's kind of the overview. All right, take a look at the list of the author's example functions here. So some of the ones, and I think, once again, I'm looking once again at my coding solutions for the evening and trying to see if there's any here that we're using that we didn't talk about yet. No, I think we I think we have them all in there, but basically they have the concatenation thing, left and right trim. We might look at those real briefly here, and I'll explain why those are useful. Left, right trim, trim in general, length, locate. That's a real useful one, by the way, because look at what this one does. It does searching, so that's kind of cool. We have left and right substrings, substring indexes, and then the list keeps going here. We have replace. So, and if you think of like the find and replace in a lot of, regular programs, similar to that, right? So that's a useful command. We have the insert reverse, right? So you can take a string and reverse it. That's kind of an odd one. Change things from upper and lower case. You can take the length of a string and pad it left or right. That's kind of an interesting one. We can do counts of spaces, and we can do repeats, right? So these are the key functions that they're focusing on in the chapter. Some of the subsequent slides are kind of interesting. And let's take a little bit of time to talk through these a little bit, because I think this is probably the most useful part of this slideshow, real frankly, is that it shows you what the command is, an example usage of it, and what the output is, right? Their columns aren't really very well formatted, so I might like do this a little bit as we're kind of going, right? But these are really kind of the commands and the outputs, right? And I think it helps to have it, if the columns are beautifully neat, that would be a whole lot better. All right, so let's take a look at that concat command. That's concatenate, right? And basically we have a last name and a first name. Notice that those are inside single quotes. When you concatenate, you're joining strings together, and you look at the output. So what's happening? There's no spaces inserted. It's just brute force joining the strings in exactly the way you're asking them to be joined, right? No additional spaces. This is a command we use quite a bit, so this one's really important to look at. I'm not sure what the WS stands for in the second one, but I think that allows us to do white space. So that allows us to add punctuation and spaces in the mix. So what it's really saying to us, that statement, is take the second and third strings in the list here and join them using this character. That's what it's really saying, right? So last, and then it does comma space first, which looks a little bit more readable, right? You have to admit that looks like a little bit better output. Another issue that we often have when we're working with computers, and this is not one that like young programmers think about a lot, but old programmers like have been doing it for a while. Like, oh yeah, people have this tendency to add extra characters when they're typing stuff in. So for example, have you ever gone to a website and they have you like log in, and then especially if you're on your phone and you hit like, oh, here's my email address, I'm just going to tap it, but then it like adds a space at the end of your email address or at the end of your password, right? And you go to log in and it prevents you from logging in just because of that extra space. So it's actually reading the space. Well, the trim commands, all of them, are designed to remove what we call leading and trailing spaces from a string of characters. The one that is really the most common is what we call the trailing spaces. So for example, think about the scenario when you're typing really fast and you're really like going at it on the keyboard. How do your fingers work? Especially if you're like you don't even look at your fingers when you type kind of person, right? Like, and I can get into that mode sometimes, but I'll type like a word and then I hit space. I type a word and then I hit space, and then I type another word and then I hit a period, and then I might go space, space, and I type capital letter, type a word, hit a space, type a word, hit a space. And so you're always like, hit a word, hit a space, right? And then what happens often is when people are filling out forms that feed information into a database, people sometimes include the space. And so you can run scripts that remove those spaces, right? Now, once again, from a practical standpoint, if I was an application developer, I would prefer to do that with my programming language before it even gets to the database. But if the application's not written well, and the information does make it to the database, you still have a mechanism in the database to remove those extraneous characters, right? So if I do a left trim, it gets rid of the spaces on the left. I do a right trim, gets rid of the spaces on the right. If I just do trim, it gets rid of both, right? So both of those are useful, right? Now, notice you can also give it parameters in the form of both, meaning the front end and the back end, right? What are we trimming? We're trimming the stars from whatever the string is that we're doing it from. So if we run this command on here, it removes them from both left and right, removes all the asterisks. All right. I'm not sure of a great scenario for that one, but I could think of, for example, like if my database is set up to store phone numbers as a number, the parentheses and the dashes that people type in phone numbers would not be allowed. So I could run a trim command, for example, to get rid of the dashes, and a trim command to get rid of the parentheses. Those are doable things, right? Upper and lower, I think those are pretty intuitive. They just take the text and flip it, basically, right? Notice these, the left and the right. If I do left and have the whole MySQL term and I say 3, it takes the first 3 characters from the left side of the string. Right takes the last 3 characters from the string. Weird usage, but there are circumstances, right, where it might be useful. For example, can anybody think of a scenario in which you might use one of these? Yeah, it's kind of a weird thought, right? How about this? Like, what if you have um somebody who's got a last name and they're a junior, right? Like um Joe Smith Jr. Where do they type the junior in? Right. So you could like write scripts that would strip the JR period, that kind of thing. It's kind of goofy usage. Once again, it's scenario driven. And so I always like to reinforce that concept. The scenario dictates when you're using this stuff. All right, let's look at some of these. So the substring function is one that allows us to basically feed in a full-length string, right? And this is kind of a weird one because what is this actually saying? How many characters are there in a phone number that's formatted like this? So let's just count them really quick. We got parenthesis. So we count all the parentheses, spaces, and punctuation marks. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? And then notice how we have 8 here. So it says start at position 7 is what this is saying, and finish with 8 total characters. Kind of interesting, right? So what it does is it counts over to position 7, which is this 5, and then grabs the next 8 characters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that's the result. So, okay, so why would you use this? Well, this example is an area code and phone number, and a lot of times in a database, a lot of your database entries might all be from the same area code, right? That's not so much the case anymore. I think that reality has kind of faded away, but there was, a time like in the city of Milwaukee, for example, where everybody, heck, southeastern Wisconsin, right? Everybody had a 414 phone number, and then they introduced 262, and now that people move all around the country and they have cell phones, the number doesn't even matter anymore. Like the area code has sometimes no indication of where you're located. All right, so that's kind of the example there. Similarly, the substrict index, right, is indicating kind of a similar approach. I can't tell you exactly what the parameters on this one are. I have to look them up. But the point is, when you use this syntax, you're feeding in this string, and then you're looking for the last 2 pieces, is what this is saying, after the first period. So here's the first period, and then grab the last two pieces after the first period, which comes out to Murach.com, right? All right, so that might be how you want to store it in your database. I'm not really sure. You can also run the length function. This is a very, very useful one, by the way. The important thing to remember is that spaces count in a string, right? So this one's length is 9, that one's length is 5. Locate is one that is used a lot for searching. So this is like the search mechanism really in a database is locate. Usually you're looking for strings, so we're locating this 3-letter sequence out of this particular piece of information, and then it will say 5 as the output. Guess what is that referring to? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in other words, position 5 is where that string begins. Pretty weird, right? It's kind of a like, why on earth would I use this, right? In this case, we're trying to locate the dash, and it's saying it's in position 10. Now we already figured out that when you look at like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? So you see, it's telling you the position of where it's located. Unlike the stuff that we're learning in the Python class where we start at position 0, notice that SQL starts counting with 1. You guys picking up on that little tidbit, right? That's the difference between Python and SQL, by the way. All right. A couple more of these, just real quick ones. If you look at like replace, write, all right, and look at all of the syntax here, what they're looking for is they want us to replace, right? Think about this, the parenthesis on either side of the 559 is really what they want us to do, so that we can then replace that second parenthesis and space with a dash, and then convert the number to this format, which might be what we need for our application to work correctly out of the database. Who knows, right? But there's reasons why we do that. All right, another command is the insert command. So if I use this, I can take this snippet of text, insert it into this string, right? And what it does is it puts it in the first position. I forget what the second parameter refers to. Notice that in one case here, I mean, they're dropping it into the first position with the space, right? So I'm not, like I said, I don't know what the 0 refers to. This one's kind of weird because this is single quotes. And then notice that Murach is a single quote, and how they have to do 2 single quotes here to make that work, right? So, and I think really what's happening here is they're doing the same basic maneuver, but showing you that if you're using all single quotes, so you have to accommodate for that single quote this way. All right, this is as far as I'm taking the lecture stuff here tonight, folks. And we're going to do a break right now. It's 6:07, let's call it. So we're going to come back at about, let's call it 6:12 or 6:13. So I'll see you guys in a little bit. The lecture video will end here, by the way.